So Chris is a very seasoned storyteller, and he's finally going to share his secrets with us. And some of us have been waiting literally years for this moment. Chris is going to teach us how, among other things, to take our stories from our own personal life and convert them into a form of entertainment, a speech that we can give and entertain others with. It's my great pleasure, therefore, to welcome up to give us and host this workshop, Chris Brown.
Hey, thank you, everyone. So when Martin asked if I could put a workshop together about storytelling, I jumped at the opportunity because it was something that I've been thinking about doing anyways. I enjoy telling stories ever since I was a young kid around a campfire and lake trips. And then as I became an adult in my professional career, recognized how storytelling can help positively influence the people that you work with and the customers that you engage with. And I brought that recognition of the power of story with me to Toastmasters and use it at Toastmasters as well to do a very similar thing. And along the way, through my Toastmasters journey, I've continued to understand and study the practice, the art, if you will, of storytelling. And so I'm happy to share that with you, to open the kimono and talk about what I know about and what I apply in my daily life, in work and in Toastmasters, with regard to storytelling. So I did put a presentation together. I'll try to share my screen now. It looks like the host needs to enable screen sharing. I'm getting the thumbs up from Martin. Let's try it again. All right, so now we are sharing the screen, and you guys can see my presentation, I assume? Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up. The other thing, guys, please do, I think throughout the presentation, I'll pause and ask for questions. And so if you think of a question that you're dying to know, just raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask it. I want this to be open and engaging with this small group. So don't hesitate to interrupt, but then I'll also, as we go through, pause and collect questions. I want this to be engaging. I may even ask and probe questions throughout the presentation. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about today. Really, these 5 parts. First, what is a story? It turns out that all of us know what a story is superficially, but many don't know what a story is below that surface. And so we're going to talk about what that is. We're going to try to define it together. We're going to talk about the power of story. You've heard maybe why stories are powerful in influencing people and organizations and customers. Why is that? We're going to talk about that. We're going to dig into the anatomy of a story, the different components of a story structure that has been pretty consistent since the dawn of time, it turns out. So we're going to talk about, there's a lot of great material there we're going to dive into. Then, how do we create stories? How do we, as Toastmasters, as storytellers, how do we collect events in our lives and present them in a way that we can tell stories to other people? How is that done? Well, I'm going to share how I do it. And I've learned different tricks along the way, and I've improved over the years. I'm going to talk about how I do that, and then you could decide for yourself if that might work for you, or if it's or if I'm crazy. There may be different ways to do it. And then, last but not least, you've got a great story. You've designed it. You've written it. How do you tell it? And so there's going to be a lot of alignment, overlap with how to present a speech, how to tell a great speech. How do you tell a story? We're going to get into that as well. Any questions any question on that? Okay. So what is a story? This is a great quote, a powerful quote. Stories are the creative conversation of life itself into a more powerful, clearer, more meaningful experience. They are the currency of human contact. That's a very powerful, it's a very profound statement, right? This is Robert McGee. He is an author. He's also a well-known, well-respected screenwriting coach, and he provides screenwriting workshops to very high level Hollywood writers, and he's done that for a long time, and he's began to converge his teachings, his workshops into the commercial world, but at any rate, this quote is powerful because what he's saying is hey, life is great, but stories take a piece of that life and make it even better. and that's a profound thing. It's like you take a piece of life, you amplify it in a way that can be shared, and that to me is really illustrates the power of story and also what a story is. The second quote that I presented here, William Carlos Williams. Does anyone know who that is? He's an American author and poet. I actually read a book of his in an English course in college. But at any rate, this quote came across that I liked as well. Their story, yours and mine, it's what we all carry with us on this trip we take, and we owe it to each other to respect our stories and to learn from them. So that helps uncover what is a story. But to get even further, another quote from McGee, and this is something that he says in his books and in his workshops, that a story is not a narration. And specifically, his quote is, all stories are narrations, but not all narrations are stories. Meaning that if you define a sequence of events that happen and then just tell it, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, that is not a story. That is a narration, but it's not a story. A story is not an anecdote. You know, what we all have those friends, families that tell those great anecdotes, but in and of themselves, they're just little pieces that happened. There's things you have to add to that anecdote to make it a story. And one more quote from McGee. I think this is the last one from him. The essential core element in all stories ever told in the history of humanity can be expressed in just 3 words: conflict changes life. And that's the key, is that you have an anecdote, an experience in your life, but when you uncover in that anecdote the conflict and the change, now you've got a story. So now we're getting closer to understanding what a story is. And this is a definition. There's a ton of definitions. This is the one that I think most closely resembles my understanding of what a story is. And it's the dynamic escalation of conflict-driven events that cause meaningful change in a character's life. So again, you've got these events in our life, but then they're coupled to change and meaning. And so when you uncover the change and meaning in these events, now you've got a story. Does that make sense to everyone? And that structure, those things together, is what defines a story since the beginning of time, when people told stories around fires, when like campfires, not like forest fires, but plays and Shakespeare and movies and our favorite movies today, our best TV shows, all have these components, these elements of stories. And why are stories so powerful? Well, they create connection. And the reason that they do that is that the stories have a core character, a protagonist. You know, sometimes there's multiple protagonists, but often it's one protagonist. And as we engage in that story, whether it's a play or a movie or a great speech, we connect with the core character. We empathize with them. We share their feelings. And by doing so, it creates those connections. And then it also, stories, they amplify understanding, because the events have change and meaning, and while we're understanding this change and the meaning and sharing these emotional feelings, we have a better understanding, more so than we might have just with facts and figures. And Dan, the engineer, is going, I don't know, facts and figures are pretty important, and he's right, but often it goes one in and out the other. It's often easier to share that understanding through the power of a story. And also, there's a lot of evidence and studies here, but it stays in our memory as well, for those same reasons above. It sticks with us. It's sticky. We don't just forget about it the next day. The other thing that I wanted to say, that connection and understanding, is that it also explains why, as we're watching a movie and we connect with the core character and we share their feelings, we almost in a way become them. We're living vicariously through that core character through the duration of the story. And some evidence for that, and explanation for that, is the reason that you could sit through a 3-hour movie and it feels like 20 minutes. Some 3-hour movies feel like they're 6 hours, but the good ones, the really engaging ones that feel shorter, it's you become virtually that person throughout the story. The other reason that they're so powerful is you take those elements, the shared understanding, clear understanding, the empathy that you have, the meaning, and if you recognize that and tell a story with purpose, then you could actually use that to drive action. And that's the reason that stories have become so popular in business recently, and why stories continue to be as popular as they are today, that because they have that, they stick in your memory, because they have that shared understanding and that deep empathy, to where you become that person for a period of time. They can be used to drive action. And so as a Toastmaster, when we give speeches, often those speeches have a call to action at the end. And when a leader in business gives a speech, there's often a call to action to align with a certain initiative or to align with values. And when that's done through a story, the way that we're defining a story today, it is much more powerful in positively influencing the audience of those stories. And because of that, because it literally is much more successful in triggering the action that's described in the story, it's very powerful for mobilizing people, for positively influencing them toward a common goal. And it's very powerful. Any questions on that so far? You guys still hear me okay? All right.
We can hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
You're loud and clear.
Okay.
You're doing well.
All right. So now we're going to dive into the anatomy of a story. And there are a lot of components. And so this next section is going to dive into what those components are. And these are the 8 stages of story design. I'm borrowing again from Robert McGee, specifically out of his book, Story, Substance, Structure, Style, and the Principles of Screenwriting. But it's really principles of story that are told in any medium. And what those components are, number one, target audience. So just like any great speech, the first thing that you want to do before you write a speech, whether it's a story or not, is understand that target audience. Who is that audience, and how are you going to connect with them? So it's not part of the story per se, but it's the first piece in story design. And then we get into the actual story itself, which starts with subject matter. Who are the people involved? Who is the main character, the protagonist? What is that life? What does that life look like? Where is the setting? What's the duration of time? When in time is it? It's that sort of setting that initial subject matter. And then there's always the the inciting incident. There's something that occurs that triggers that conflict for the protagonist. Something that flips their world upside down and changes everything. And this is true in all stories, and all good stories, but pretty much all stories. Even in comedies, that it's not just suspense or drama that have these inciting incidents. It's even comedies have these incidents that changes, that flips the world of the protagonist so that they have to go take action. And it causes, so the inciting incident changes the world, creates imbalance. The object of desire is the thing, not necessarily an object, but the thing that the protagonist identifies and seeks out to bring their world back in balance. And that could be, we're going to get into the details of that, but it doesn't have to be an object. It could be anything. Then there's a first action. The protagonist takes an action to bring their world back to normal. And then there's a reaction. The protagonist discovers that the world has these external forces that are more powerful than what they thought. And so there's a reaction, and there's it's described the violation of expectation. And to simplify that, it's a surprise. And so that's the opportunity to have that next big surprise in the story. And then from that reaction, there's a crisis choice and a second action, followed by the climactic reaction, the end. Is the object of desire obtained? Is balance returned? Often it is. Sometimes it's not. So those are the core elements of the story. I'm going to go into them in just a little bit more detail. So target audience. What I did here is I added these questions that as you're beginning to design a story for yourself, that you could ask yourself that relate to these components. So I'm trying to describe the components, but really sort of change it to, in many cases, a series of questions that you just ask yourself. So starting with, for the target audience, who is your target audience? What are the common threads between the target audience and the core character? Because you want to relate to the audience, right? What thoughts and feelings do you want to invoke in the audience throughout your story? So those are some of the questions related to that first piece. And then subject matter. What's the location of time? Is it present? Is it, I often find a lot of my stories that come from growing up, childhood. So a lot of my stories occurred in the 80s. And then the duration. Some stories might just be the duration of time within the story might just be like a day or a half hour. Some could stretch a couple years, multiple years, right? What's the duration of your story? What's the physical location? Are you at home? Is it at work? Are you on a camping trip in the Sierras? Where is location? And what's the social location? Are you with family? Is it with work? With your fellow Toastmasters? Socially, where is it taking place? And then what is the core value? So the core value is, we talked about the change of a story, and that value is what changes throughout. And so the subject matter is where you can introduce that core value. And the value in stories isn't just a single value like justice or courage, but rather there's a binary piece to it. So when we think about a core value in a story, it is positive, negative. So for example, the value might be truth, lie. It could be love and hate. So any love story, it's not just about love. If a love story was just about love, it'd be love this, love this, love this. We'd want to, we'd get sick, right? It's love, hate, right? It's that binary piece. It's hard work, laziness, loyalty, betrayal, life and death. that there's a binary. And so what is that binary core value that is gonna change throughout the story? And then the more specific the setting, the more appeal. And this is where for fiction, the possibilities are endless in terms of specific settings. For real stories that we often think about and tell, there's opportunities as unique Toastmasters to have unique settings and unique actions from what we do. The inciting incident, the incident that causes that imbalance. So you've got this setting, you've got this value that's about neutral, and then all of a sudden something happens. The protagonist's world is flipped upside down. And so some of the questions to think about is, one, what is the inciting incident? What did happen? Did it happen by accident or by decision? So sometimes you could change your own world, flip it upside down by an explicit action or decision that you made, that the protagonist made. Did the incident first move the core value to the positive or to the negative? Many stories, many movies, many stories that I tell often that the inciting incident brings it to the negative, right? But I should say occasionally it brings it to the positive. I just watched Annie with my kids the other day. My daughter wanted to see it, and the inciting incident is actually positive, right? She was adopted temporarily for a week by Daddy Warbucks. That was a inciting incident that was in the positive, and then that led to conflict and other change. But initially, it was positive. Empathy from the protagonist merged with curiosity. That's where suspense comes from, and that's how we engage the audience. So it's like we start to share the protagonist's feelings, and then this event happens. We're like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen. How is this going to turn out? That the result of that is suspense. We're leaning in. We want to hear what happens. The object of desire is that thing that the core character believes he or she must obtain to regain control of their life. And so some obvious questions here. What is that object of desire? And it doesn't have to be something physical. It often could be. It could be an increase in it could be a raise. It could be that someone appreciates you. It could be a job promotion, a divorce. It could be something deeper, like just having like insight to yourself. That you want to have that insight. You believe that's the solution to your problem. So object of desire, we call it object. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's an object itself. Ideally, each object of desire is unique and specific. So it gets back to that. Just as a setting that's unique is more interesting, a unique object of desire is more interesting too. And even though we tell true stories, those objects of desires can be very unique because we're all differently so unique ourselves. The first action, the core character sets off to rebalance his life. He has this idea that if he obtains this object of desire, he could bring things back. So he takes the first action to solve their problem. And so what is that first action based on the object of desire? What is the first thing that the protagonist does to fix this problem, this conflict? The best stories have unique actions, just like and unique behaviors, and the less enjoying stories are more general and mediocre. To create a meaningful emotional experience for the audience, the storyteller, now that they've got the setting and the action, from sort of starting with that first action and the rest of the story, really just focuses on describing the events that embrace the change to that core value. So going back to that core value, justice, injustice, or whichever it is, this action seeks to improve that. And the action, the reactions we talk about in a little bit should all be focused around that core value change. First reaction. Do you like these icons? So the list I got from the book, I pulled out the list, but then I actually searched these icons. These are PowerPoint icons that I connected to these, and I was pretty happy with this. I like this one. This is the balls. First reaction, the violation of the core character's expectation. So the core character takes an action, and then all of a sudden realize, oh my God, this world, the external forces against me are much more powerful than I knew. And so it's a surprise. And in any good story has surprise. And this is the opportunity to have a big surprise. And so first, those forces of antagonism that happen can come from different sources. And I've listed the four. They could come from physical obstacles. So anything in the world could be an object. Anything in the universe could be an object that causes a force of antagonism. But they could also be social obstacles, right? They could be obstacles that came out from social obstacles from institutions, from a school or government or church. They could be personal obstacles from family. Uncle John isn't on board with your first action and is an obstacle. And then finally, inner obstacles. So they could be like deep inner feelings that within yourself that contradict what you're trying to do. So that there's a ton of opportunities there. And this first reaction, it's the opportunity for a big surprise, but also to go back to change in that core value. It's a big change, right? So there's a problem from the inciting incident. There's an action to fix it, but then what happens here is we shoot back down to the negative. So it's surprise and a big change in that core value. So two of the questions I had to think about here is, how can you amplify the surprise? And one way to think about that is one, to really be clear on what those forces do to that value to change, but also if a surprise is a violation of expectations, what you can do to amplify that is within your story, set it up so that there are expectations that's going to go one way, but then go another way, right? And there's ways to do that. If you think about it, ways to word that and information to reveal to the audience that can set up an expectation for the audience, just as for the protagonist, that then gets flipped as a surprise. And then it's more effective for the audience. Then there's a crisis choice, that they've done this action and it's failed, and they're actually further away from their object of desire. But they've also have more insight now. They have more information from these external forces, and how those forces are going to present or affect the protagonist from getting to their goal. And so now with that additional information and insights, what are those final choices that the protagonist is going to make for their final action? So some of the questions I put are, what is that final choice? What is the character's insight? What did they learn from those other turning points, from the reaction? How are the stakes raised, right? There's a cost in a lot of this. And so there's a cost if the protagonist can't bring the world back to normal. And sometimes in this crisis choice, they've already tried to make the world be back to normal and they failed. Are those costs even higher now? If they are, how are they, and how can you communicate that as part of your story? And what does the character stand to lose? So it's sort of related to the stakes. And then the climactic reaction, the end. Did the protagonist obtain her object of desire? Sometimes they don't, right? And Often they do, sometimes they don't, and they realize what they were searching for the whole time wasn't what they needed, and the object of desire might have switched. So did they obtain it? Why not? What was the change, to go back to that binary value? Justice, injustice. Did they get back to justice, and is it a permanent change for them? What questions were answered? What was the meaning? Those are all things to think about as you provide the final reaction. And then to tie it all back together, you can see that here's that full list. And this you probably have heard before for story, is that there's a beginning, middle, and end. But you see it's much more complex than just beginning, middle, and end. But this is what it looks like. The other thing I should say, I mentioned these specific components are from McGee, but there are this basic structure. There are a ton of authors and influencers that have highlighted this as story, and they're all very similar to this structure that we talked about today. They all have a beginning, middle, and end. They all have a subject matter, something that happens, a conflict, first action, reaction, then an ending. So that's the next section. That's the end of this section, I should say. The next section we're talking about is how we create these stories ourselves. Before we go into that, are there any questions about these stages of a story or any of these components, pieces that we talked about?
So, Chris,
Yeah.
Chris, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Julie.
Hi,
So
Julie.
hi. So as you're talking, and then you mentioned, a movie, Annie, and then I started thinking about movies, and there's different steps on what that would be in a certain movie that I saw.
Mm-hmm.
So that was helpful to bring in, a movie. And then I was also thinking that sometimes I bet when there's not these steps, the movie is like boring or flat, or
Yes.
I'm wasting my time on this.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, before I learned this structure, I always had a sense, I could go, like we all can, right? We go in a movie. I always felt I had a good taste I'd walk out of a movie and for whether that movie was good or bad, but I never could really articulate why, and I think that's most of us. When you understand these pieces and sort of study these pieces and then go watch a movie or a play, you can now articulate why it wasn't good. That you couldn't empathize with the character. The change it didn't have dynamic change. It didn't have meaning, right? There's specific things that it lacks. And sometimes bad movies have these pieces, but they're just not powerful enough. They're subtle and boring. And one of the things I've challenged you to do now, and it's quite fun for me, is when I sit down and when I watched Annie, as I'm watching, I think about these things and point them out. And it's fun to do, because even in like a 30-minute sitcom, you see these structures in play. In a play, in a movie, especially all the high quality TV shows now that are that have been triggered by the Sopranos. There's just a huge list of great television shows that have like movie quality appeal, and the good ones apply this, and they apply it really well. So it's fun to think about as you watch a show or movie or play. Or a story, a speech next time, right?
Hey, Chris, Ranjita here. I really, when you started walking through this, it reminded me of the story you told last week. I could see the crisis, that crisis moment and your decision, like kind of your insight. So I was wondering, as you get into the next one, if you'll maybe kind of show us those examples or some other examples. It just helps connect the dots. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
May I just
Chris,
a question?
Sorry.
Sorry, a quick question. There is some kind of color code on this slide. Is it something you can explain?
So it's just a slide design. I've got these three main colors, and I just repeat them. So the colors aren't tied to the objects themselves, other than I just repeat them throughout. So there's no secret color code. No.
Oh,
It's
okay.
It's just aesthetic.
Chris, Henry.
Hey, Henry.
Yeah, given the speech is 5 to 7 minutes, how many of the 8 you focus on when you're preparing a speech?
Yeah. Thank you, Henry. I was going to get into that. One thing I'll say is often what I found, it's difficult to incorporate all of these, and there's not enough time to incorporate all of these.
Right.
But what happens is when you take, as you'll see in the next section, when you take an event that happened that starts with an anecdote, and you ask yourself, you sort of take that anecdote and you map it to all these, you'll find that some of them sort of rise to the top, and those are the ones you want to grab and implement in your story, and others you just won't be able to. Because they just didn't happen. We tell true stories, and so that's hard. Hopefully that answers your question. I think we're going to get into it a little bit more. The answer is they don't always have it, but when you think about each one explicitly, many will come up and allow you to articulate it in the story.
And I have one more quick question that I hope you would address. How do you tell a true story versus a fictional story?
So I had a teacher one time tell me that all stories are true and some really happened. But the truth is that all the stories that I tell are true because I don't write nonfiction. I just write, I tell stories that happened. Now, I will admit there's some gray area because I mentioned that I've got a lot of stories from childhood, and in the 80s, that was a while ago. So luckily I've got this thing where I've got a good memory for things that happened, almost like I could see it as a video in real time, things 30 years ago. And that helps. And there's some other techniques, but what you have to do is just honestly capture the things that you recall and relate that in ways that really happen. But what happens is even when you end up getting all these pieces of things that you know happened, even if it's fuzzy, and you can rearrange them in certain ways to provide those reactions, that surprise, right? So does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
It does.
Okay. All right. How do we create stories? So this is now kind of what my approach, and I want to share it with you, and really interested to hear what you guys think and how I can improve it as well, how we can improve it. So it starts with anecdotes. It starts with things that happen in our life that are memorable. And so what I did 4 years ago was I went into Evernote and I put together a list. So I had this list in my head all my life of these things that happened. And so if I was at a dinner party, I'll just go through that mental list and I'll tell a story, of something that happened. But what I did 4 years ago was I said, that's hard. And as I continue to move through this world in this life, I'm getting more and more of these anecdotes. I got to write them down. So I opened Evernote and I just started writing them down. And I actually want to just for fun, since we're really, let me see here. We're opening the kimono, right? I want to, let's see, share with you. I wasn't planning to do this. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. Can you see my screen? Can you guys see my screen? Okay, so this is Evernote. This is CB's anecdote list, and I started this 4 years ago. So in 1985, there's a payphone, and I learned that if you can make a collect call, and then if it got denied, you stay on the line, you could then call anywhere. And I proved it by calling Hawaii. That just is an anecdote. I don't know if that's a story, but it's something that happened. It's on the list. I told this story of a while ago. I woke up in the morning. I was on the front page of the Salinas, California newspaper, and I was in a headlock being pinned. It was horrible. That happened to me. Wilderness survival, Pico Blanco summer camp. I actually did a story with the moth on that. I've got a long list of stories of lake trips. Just did crazy stuff at the lake. Long list of backpacking trips. The AAPM is the American physics of medicine. I was in a hotel, and there was this window in the hotel next to my hotel room. The window had blinds, and in front, the blinds were closed. In front of the blinds, facing the window, was a note that read, "Please help me." And it freaked me out. We called security, and there was no one in the room. But that happened. There was, when I first joined my first company out of college, around 2001, it was hilarious because this was the dot-com, actually 2000s dot-com bubble. I had all these friends with all these companies getting all these perks and free like espresso bars. But for me, the company I worked for, they would have this big percolator that was filled with Folgers ground coffee, and they charged us $0.25 for it. And the list is on and on and on and on and on. Okay, so that's my anecdote list. Let's go back. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I recommend, what I continue to do myself and I recommend for you, is to capture those anecdotes, to capture those things that happen in your life that are memorable, and just to get it down, because otherwise, if you don't do that, they could disappear, right? And what I do is I revisit that and I realize, oh yeah, there was that one time that I did this. Like something will trigger a memory of an event that happened to you that's interesting, and I'll go back and I'll add it. So keep an anecdote list. The other thing that I recommend doing is keeping a journal. And so this was in addition to just anecdote lists of things that already happened. On a daily basis or maybe weekly, just write down what happened in your life today, and that adds opportunities for events that could be turned into story, even if they seem boring or non-meaningful. Write them down. Write down what happened, because they could turn into a story later on. Okay. So now you've got this list of anecdotes. You've got this journal of things that happened to you, and what do you do? What do you do with that? So the next thing is that we talked about those. The story is events, change, and meaning, right? So what you do? Take those list of anecdotes, or take each one individually, and ask yourself a series of questions. I came up with these questions sort of based on the structure, based on a way to connect change and meaning to that anecdote. So ask yourself, why do I do the things that I do related to that anecdote? This is some behavior that you did. Why did I do that? What was the reason for that? What was the thing that happened to me? And then think about time before and time after. What did I do before? Not what did do before. What did I do before that anecdote, that event? What did I do after that event? What changed for myself? What was the binary value, right? Was there something that's related to success, failure, justice, injustice, love, hate? Is there a binary value there? And if so, what changed? What revelations did I have after it happened? Whether the event itself or those things that you did after. What stages, and then finally, what stages of the story do I have? And if you ask yourself these questions, and there's probably others, but if you ask yourself these questions tied to those anecdotes, and you have interesting answers, and you find and you identify change and identify meaning, now you've got something that's story worthy, right? Now you've got something that's story worthy. And then, so now you've got this list of questions. You've got something story worthy, you've got events, you've got change, you have meaning. So go back to the stages of the story, those components, and write down what you have and what they are. You know, those questions that I had in each section. Start to answer them and see which ones rise to the top. Add backstory to the story as a way to excuse me. Add backstory as a way to give the audience more information, to empathize with yourself if you're the protagonist, and just backstory to give more information to the setting where you're at. Don't be afraid to use dialogue. Dialogue, I found, I used to sort of avoid it, but it's pretty powerful to sort of relive in virtually what actually happened in dialogue. So pull dialogue in to your story if possible. And then the other thing is create images in the audience mind. So almost when you've got the anecdotes, the meaning, all the components that you're trying to piece together, you're moving it around. And as you're describing it, whether you're writing it down or speaking out loud, speak in a way that you're painting a picture for the audience is the best way to think about it, right? Paint that picture for the audience. So instead of saying that you sat in a chair, say that you sat so if I could say I sat in a chair, or I could say that I sat in a bright red leather-bound chair. Those are two very different things that help to paint that picture. The other thing is that this other quote, John Steinbeck. So some of you know I grew up in Salinas, the John Steinbeck country. This is a quote from John Steinbeck, which is, if you're using dialogue, say it aloud as you write it. Only then will it have the sound of speech. One of the problems that I have, and I sort of still struggle a little bit, is that when I sit down to write, it ends up sounding like an essay and not a speech, not a story. And so not just dialogue, but for me is that just in general, whether it's a speech or story, to sort of say it out loud as you write it to avoid it sounding like an essay. So it sounds like a conversation, right? So found that to help. But really, you take all those pieces and you put them together in something that fits for us is in a speech, in a story within a speech. Does that make sense? Any questions? We just have a few more minutes. I've got one little section. Any question on that, guys?
No questions. Looks good. Thank you.
The last one, how do we tell the stories? So now you've got this great story written. How do we tell it? And I think that there's a lot of overlap here with how to tell a great speech. But this is what I wanted to talk about. First is rehearse, right? Whether speech or story, you've got to practice it. And Mark Twain, who was an amazing storyteller in and of himself, it turns out that for the last third of his life, he didn't really write as much as he just traveled the world and told speeches. He told stories and speeches. So he would visit different places and he would tell speeches. And he was quoted as saying that he would practice and put in time that was 10x the amount of time to give a speech. So if it was a 1 hour speech, 10 hours of effort, right? So rehearse. The other thing is as you're telling it, this is something that I've talked about and others have talked about, is that contrast. Just as a good story has contrast change in the value. Good speeches, good stories as they're told have contrast in both the speed and volume of how you talk. And so look for opportunities where something that is exciting or urgent, increase the speed, increase the volume. Something that's important, particularly at the end where you're describing a call to action or the meaning, slow down and actually get quieter and say it to add that contrast and cause the audience to lean in and listen, recognizing that it's important. The other thing is reimagine the story in your mind. So as you're telling it, not just as you lived it, but as you're telling it with all those pieces together, imagine it in your mind happening as you're telling it to make it more realistic and brings the audience into your world of the story that you're trying to tell. And then the other thing is that this is a good story, a good speech should just be conversational and comfortable. So one of the tricks that I do is just imagine that you're at a dinner table with a few of your closest friends, your closest family, and you're just telling them a story, you know, and try to have that mentality, even if you're telling it to 100 people. Just imagine you're at a dinner table telling 5 of your closest friends and family your story. Let's see. Okay. So putting it all together. Stages of a story. Understand, and I'll send everyone a PDF of this presentation. But go back, study those stages of a story. When you watch a movie, when you hear a speech, watch a play, identify those stages, revisit them and understand them. Collect those experiences in your life. Collect those anecdotes that happen. Collect the daily things that happen, because otherwise they'll just disappear. You'll forget them and they're gone forever. So don't let them be gone. Capture them. Collect them. Revisit those things and try to connect change and meaning to them to see if they're story worthy. And then if they are, build it by mapping it back to the stage of the story, seeing what pieces come up, rearrange those pieces in a story that has multiple events, meaningful change, and meaning. And then finally, tell your story. Rehearse, imagine, and tell it. Just to go back to that quote that I provided in the beginning, stories are the creative conversation of life itself into a more powerful, clearer, more meaningful experience. They are the currency of human contact. If that is true, as Toastmasters, how can we not tell stories? Thank you.
Thank you.
A great job, Chris. I really liked how you peeled back the curtain and you showed exactly how you formulate your stories. And one thing that resonated with me, I think it was about a month and a half ago, you talked about a story of how you created one of the very first parades in the city. And I just remember the descriptive language you used and then the dialogue, and you kind of shifted your body as well as you told the story, and you incorporated multiple characters, I think Johnny and someone else. But this was awesome. And some of the things that I take away are just keeping track of any of those funny or odd things or those experiences that you live daily. We hear it in a lot of different speakers here, but I just seeing the mechanics of how you go through and develop a story, I think is highly beneficial. And I want to thank you for sharing this in the workshop today.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you,
Definitely.
Chris. That
Yeah.
was really,
Very well
really
put.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, very well thought out and put together.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Fantastic.
Wonderful work. I'm on about my 10th story 5.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you brought back some memories back when I guess it was in the 80s. I was on a mission to write screenplays. I really wanted to be a screenwriter. And so I studied the Sid Field method, who was the godfather of screenwriting then. And I still have, books on, and it's the same thing. It's just talking again. They said it in words like plot point 1, plot point 2. There were different terminologies, but it's the same basic stuff,
Yep.
Very, very well done.
If I can add, Michael, if I can add one more to your file, one more to your the people that you follow, Michael Haig. He's also a screenwriter and storyteller that is kind of semi-involved with Toastmasters.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Michael
That's
Haig.
very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was great. Really good.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris. It was fantastic.